Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for joining this webinar and happy St. Patrick's Day. So this is a presentation on the fundamentals of qualitative research. And I'm Katie Shakur. I'm a research associate at Clemson's Center for Workforce Development, and I come to you with a background in social sciences. So the presentation I'm going to provide is a brief overview of qualitative research, the goals, the methods, and the analysis. And I am hoping that this will introduce you to qualitative research, especially if you come from a background in quantitative research, and you might think of new ways to enhance your research. And the topics I'm introducing could really be expanded to be a whole semester's worth of material. So keep that in mind as I go through this material. Feel free to ask questions. You can type them in the Q&A section and we'll be getting to those. And we have plenty of time at the end for question and answers, but please add those as they come to you, and I'll definitely address them. Qualitative research is research that explores answers to questions. It's a systematic collection of non-numerical data like text, video, or audio, and it really aims to understand the concepts, opinions, or experiences related to a topic. And qualitative research gathers in-depth insights into a problem, and it generates new ideas or research. So it's a really effective way for generating new ideas for research, which has broader applications. And qualitative research is also an iterative process. And that means that you revise it throughout the research. So you might be working on an aspect of the methods, but you adapt your methods depending on how well that goes as you do it. So you're constantly reworking it, and in the end, you have a really well-designed research project. And if you're a quantitative researcher, qualitative research is a little different because it uses inductive reasoning rather than deductive reasoning. And that means qualitative research draws conclusions and generalizations from multiple lines of evidence. And I like to think of it as working from the ground up. The up is the hypothesis or the generalizations, and qualitative research works your way up to that. And that's different than quantitative research, where you often start with your hypothesis or generalization. And while these two approaches are different, they really go hand in hand and can work well together to produce a really wonderful research project. And qualitative research really can help with the application of quantitative data and research. When you're formulating your qualitative research project, it's helpful to start to think about how an in-depth insight can enhance an aspect of your research. And your research should be focused, but exploratory and inductive. Again, so we don't want to start with a hypothesis. We want to start with explorations related to our research topic. And that's going to generate new ideas. So your question should also address a gap in the literature, just like other research. And your research goals will guide your methods and also frame your analysis. And I'll get into more detail later in this presentation about how your research goals will guide your methods and frame your analysis. And I'm going to use the research I'm currently working on as an example throughout this research project. I'm part of a research team right now looking at COVID and education, to use two really big keywords. And we may hypothesize in our research that schools use lab-based classes schools use 3D models in their lab-based classes to continue teaching during COVID. But that's not really a qualitative research question. It's not exploratory. So if we were to rephrase it, we would start by thinking about, we would rework it to start with exploring and also make it focused. So our goal of this project, the project I'm currently working on, is to better understand the immediate responses to the COVID-19 crisis of two-year colleges with advanced technological programs in their efforts to maintain academic continuity. And right from the beginning, it's different than that hypothesis I stated a couple minutes ago. This project starts by just exploring, but it's a lot more focused too, because your projects need to be feasible. So I already focused this project by creating a time frame, immediate responses of the COVID crisis. Then I also really narrowed my study by talking about which kinds of educational programs I'm going to study. 2-year colleges that have advanced technological education programs. And one more focused way to really make it a feasible project is that I'm focusing on academic continuity. So that's where it's really different, starting from the ground up with inductive reasoning and qualitative data. At this point in our research project, or if this were a workshop, you would have a question that was exploratory and inductive in nature. And you're excited to get started. So the first step would be to get approval or exemption from your school or research institution's internal review board, or IRB. And IRBs are necessary for any research that involves human subjects. And it's all about ensuring ethical research. And if you have questions about where the history of IRBs, I recommend reading the Belmont report. And IRB processes, IRB approval and exemptions do take some time. It's a longer process. So I recommend getting started with that early. You can even start it before you have your research question formulated, because there are some training videos you need to get through in order to apply for IRB approval for a project. So you might as well get started early. You can go to Clemson's IRB website. They have a great office that'll help you through the process. And so after you get your IRB approval, you would start building rapport. And this is about building trust with the community, with the stakeholders that you're going to work with. And it might seem like a daunting process to start building rapport, but it's really quite easy. You start thinking about the connections you already have. Maybe your advisor or a colleague does a quantitative research project with the community you're interested in researching or doing work with. And so from there, they could introduce you. But you should also be bold and just send emails or make phone calls and introduce yourself and the research you're doing. And I recommend tracking your efforts, building like a virtual Rolodex or keeping an Excel file of your outreach efforts and your communication with different stakeholder groups. And that's going to help you with the next step, which is gathering data. And I'm going to talk a little bit or next about different methods for gathering data, but you would also, the fourth step would be analyze the data and then disseminate it. So those are the last 3 steps in NAME are things you're familiar with, but we're going to talk about how to do gathering data and analyzing the data with respect to qualitative research. So there are 5 qualitative research methods I'm going to talk to you about, and most projects use more than one research method. You're probably familiar with some of them, and others might be a little new to you. There's observations, interviews, surveys, focus groups, and secondary research. And so you're probably familiar with interviews and surveys and maybe some focus groups as a participant, maybe. Observations. This is when you're out in the field, whatever your field is, and that's dependent on your research, and where you are taking notes and you're literally recording what you see. And what you record and observe becomes the data. And in some cases, it may be appropriate to participate. And this is often used in combination with interviews and other methods. So you would start by observing and then begin the interview process. So for our current research on teaching and learning during COVID, I could have incorporated observations into the methods by sitting in on a virtual classroom or sitting in on a classroom in person with social distancing and masking to observe the techniques schools were using and programs were using. So that's how observation is. And you would just take notes and type those up, and then those become your data. And the main concept is you're asking, what are people doing, and what do people say about what they're doing? So you're really understanding a behavior or an experience in observations. You're probably really familiar with interviews. We see them on the news constantly. And interviews are really helpful to provide an in-depth individual perspective. And I like to think of them as one-on-one guided conversations. The interviewer has a protocol that is really well thought out. For example, our research team worked for well over a month on the different protocols we were creating for our research project. And you're going to revise that protocol along the way. That's part of the iterative process of qualitative research. So for our instructor protocol during the interviews, we were ready to conduct our first pilot interview, and we started going through the questions. And I was ready to ask a question about COVID awareness. And so I read it exactly the way we had typed it out in our protocol. How aware of COVID were you? And immediately our participants sat back and thought, when did I first become aware of COVID? And she expressed that. And after she answered the question, we went through the interview. I was talking with my colleague, and we both said that that's a much better way to talk about COVID awareness. So we changed our protocol after we found out that what we originally planned didn't work as well as it could. And it was the question that was going to elicit the same type of data. So that was a helpful way to revise our protocol. These interviews are also semi-structured. And what that means is that you're asking open-ended questions and you leave room for probing and exploration. And this allows the interviewer to follow up when the participant says something that was unexpected or really interesting. You might ask for an further explanation of what the participant just said. And that's how we generate new ideas, which will help with qualitative research applications. And as with other methods, you want to take notes and record if possible. And that's something you would determine. You would ask the participant, or it would be written out in the consent form that you're going to take notes, and the participant would agree to that. And that's also part of your IRB. So you're going to take notes and record if it's permissible. And finally, there's not a set number of interviews that you would do for your research. It's all dependent on your individual project and when you reach data saturation. And by data saturation, I mean that when you conduct an interview, you're not gaining any new insights or additional interviews. So there's not a reason to continue doing interviews at this point. After interviews, it's often common to follow up with surveys. Surveys are another method you're probably familiar with. And surveys are lists of questions aimed at getting answers to specific aspects of your research. And we're often testing trends that we observed in the interviews. So that's why it follows the interview process. And like interviews, they can produce really broad but also in-depth data. And you can get both qualitative and quantitative data in surveys. So it's a really helpful tool for really getting in some answers after you're exploring a little bit. And there are a number of benefits to surveys. You can get a large number of participants in surveys. So for our interviews, we conducted 40 interviews before we got data saturation, before we reached data saturation. And if we wanted to do 600 surveys, that would take a lot longer, and that wouldn't be necessarily feasible with our research timeframe. But with surveys, we want to get about 600 participants from across the US. And that's a lot more feasible because surveys are self-administered. There are a number of online tools that you can use to get participants to take your surveys. And participants often like the ability to do surveys from their own homes and on their own time. So that actually helps with getting participants. And additionally, surveys alleviate potential power differentials or differentiation between researchers and participants. And so they might be more comfortable to talk and share some experiences or to type some experiences out in a survey rather than talking to you. So there are a lot of benefits to doing a survey. The next method is focus groups. And focus groups are small groups of people that are brought together to discuss a clearly defined topic. And I recommend keeping focus groups pretty small, maybe about 10 participants or less. And you're going to have a moderator in there guiding the conversation. And they're like interviews in a number of ways. You're generating new ideas that weren't considered before. And having the group conversation can help spark new ideas. You're also producing in-depth data, and you can probe, as the moderator, probe into some of the answers to get even richer data. And you have the flexibility to probe. And then in focus groups, you're testing and clarifying some preconceived notions that you might have come up with during observations or interviews or surveys. So that's how the methods go hand in hand with each other. One thing to be aware of when you're planning a focus group is that there are group dynamics you need to consider. You need to think about if there are particularly shy people who might, you want to ask them to participate in the focus group. And there might be some people who are a little more vocal. So you want to balance the group dynamics when you're asking the people to come together, maybe do multiple focus groups to make sure everyone's voice and experience can be heard. But in general, focus groups are a great way to get people to share their opinions and experiences and spark new ideas. The final method I want to talk about is secondary research, and it's where you're collecting data from other material. There might be some relevant texts out there, or for the project we're currently working on, there was a preliminary research project done about 9 months ago, and they have some interviews and some other data that will be relevant to our research. So that's some secondary research that'll definitely be applicable to our research. So definitely keep that as another method to do. So you have your research question and you've worked on establishing rapport and are ready to actually gather data. It's important to consider the best types of sampling strategies given your research questions and goals. And most qualitative research is going to use more than one type of sampling strategy. There's random, where literally every member of the population has an equal chance of being asked to participate in the study. And so you could walk to the grocery store and in the parking lot, ask someone to participate in the research, and that would be random. But random is not always the best strategy. For the research we're currently doing, random wouldn't work because if I walked up to that person in the grocery store parking lot, they might not be a student at all, or let alone a student in one of these advanced technological education programs. And that's where we want to do some targeted sampling. And that's where you're recruiting participants from specific populations. So for the project I'm doing right now, we are talking to students, administrators, and instructors at these particular education programs at two-year colleges. And with that, we want to also make sure that the students were there during COVID, because some students might have started after COVID, a month ago. So that's another type of targeting that we're doing. And the third type of sampling strategy I want to talk about is called snowball sampling. And I find this to be one of the most helpful ways to get participants for your research. And snowball sampling is where you ask one of your participants to help you recruit other participants. So I had emailed an instructor at one of these programs, and after the interview, I asked her, would she be willing to share my contact information and the study information with her colleagues and with her students to help me get participants? And it's a great way to get participants because you already have some level of trust when you built rapport and conducted that interview with the instructor. And then that fundamental trust and that relationship of trust is then passed on, where the instructor can say, this was a really good research project to participate in. I recommend my students to participate in this. So it's a really great way to get more participants in your study using rapport after you've interviewed a couple people. So after you gather the data, some basic steps, you want to transcribe or type up all your notes and get them on your computer. And there are transcription services out there to help you transcribe, or there's hardware and software. There's like a pedal you can buy to make pause recordings. if you're doing manual transcriptions. And then after typing the notes, you really want to start exploring the data. You want to read all the transcriptions. You want to look for different patterns or recurring themes. And you want to read your notes to see if there's something you noted that didn't, maybe someone's emotions, you noted one of their emotions when they were talking about a particular topic. So you want to incorporate that data into your exploration of patterns and themes. And then you're going to start to code the data. I'm going to talk about coding next, which is followed with analysis. Coding the data is the start of processing and analyzing data. And codes are short words or phrases that characterize parts of the interview. To start coding, you want to create a code structure. And there are 3 ways to approach this. You could create it inductively, where again, from the ground up, from the data you've generated in your qualitative research, you would start to think about words or phrases that are important to your research. You could also do it deductively, where you find a set of predefined codes and you use them. Or you could do a combination of both. And I think the combination is actually the most helpful. Right now for the research we're doing, I used a combination method because we had this preliminary research that has been, they're publishing this preliminary study that's really relevant to our study because it's an extension of that study. So I'm going to use what they thought about, but also add to it to create our code structure. And when you actually start coding, you're going to read the entire transcript, and then you'll go back to the beginning and start applying codes to parts of the interview. And you're going to pick out specific quotes that apply to these codes. And there's software out there to help you analyze and code the data and organize it. We're using Atlas TI for our project, and it's really helpful, especially as your research projects grow and you have 40, 50 interviews, 600 surveys. There are tools out there to help you organize your data, and you should really I recommend taking advantage of those. So when you begin analyzing the data, textual analysis is a great approach. And it's where you start gleaning information from the text. You're going to start describing and categorizing common words or phrases and ideas in the data, and then that leads to identifying and interpreting patterns and themes that appear within the data. And so I have 2 quotes from recent interviews as an example. And here I asked the participants about learning resources during COVID and what types of resources were helpful for them. And so to start, I would have read participant 37's interview in its entirety, and then I'm going back through and I'm like, he's talking about modeling here. I might highlight this section of the modeling. I've seen 3D models for all sorts of different working components, especially how things work when they're off. When you turn them on, it shows them how they've come together and whatnot. And I might stop there with that quote. And I might identify that as a 3D model. I might link 3D models as a code to that quote. And then when I'm going through and coding participant 31's interview, I might see the quote here, they found 3D modeling and animations to show how to work a hydraulic system, how it works on the inside. And I might also code that for 3D models. But I could also approach these 2 quotes differently. I could highlight the whole quote for participant 37 and include the conversation about, I've never seen our class use them or anything like it. I feel like it'd be easier than just looking at a flat 2D picture. And I can include the whole quote on the second one to include, they tried their best. And I might code that with engaged learning with visuals, or teaching techniques with visuals. So there are 2 different ways I could work these quotes, and that depends on your research question and research goals. So that's where your research goals guide your analysis. And as our research team, we want to know what tools were useful, but also, why and the how behind their usefulness for students. So I'd probably do more of the whole quote for our particular research. As you continue analyzing the data, you're going to begin to identify patterns and connections within and between the codes. And you want to think about deviations between the codes or what might cause those deviations. For example, we have one participant who is a student participant who is starting a second career in this advanced technological education program. He was a physician and retired after 30 years as a physician. So his experience learning and the classroom setting and his experience is really different than an 18-year-old who just started this research. So that could cause some deviations. His statements might cause some deviations in our research. And so that's just something to consider. And as you are analyzing the data, you're thinking about the larger importance of the codes or the categories. Some codes might just have been there to help you organize the data, and they aren't really speaking to a larger interpretive pattern. But we're going to start asking about how important is this code given our research question. And you might revise your code structure while you're doing this. And you want to start to consider the relationship between the codes, because that's where you're going to start answering why. So why would certain codes go together? Are there cause and effect relationships between the codes? Is there a temporal relationship between the codes? And that's where you're starting to take a step back from those quotes and understand more about the larger patterns. And so, for example, I saw a relationship between virtual reality and simulations and training and resources. And when I was doing more of the research and taking a step back from the two quotes, I started to see those codes as part of a larger conversation about the future and the education and where education's going, rather than experiences that people had. And that's going to help me start to explore data and trends and start to get to the application of this research. During analysis, it's really important to avoid oversimplification. You really want to think about multiple factors that could contribute to some of these interpretations. And you're going to start to see interesting stories emerge. You're going to think about how they shed light on broader research. And it's just about taking one baby step back, another baby step back to think about the connections between codes and quotes. So we take another step back. And I think a great question to ask is, what did I learn? What am I learning as I do this? So I looked at visuals and virtual reality, and then I saw that it was connected to economic and financial codes and quotes. And that led to my theoretical framework. And so that's where I started to move from beyond the quotes, those two quotes, into a broader theory. So I started at the ground level and then working my way up to the generalizations in the theory. And for this research project, we're using technology acceptance and engineering resistance theory. So I saw from those two quotes, the students liked the 3D visuals and the simulations and the models. And gathering information from some of the other interviews, I saw that it's because they like the feedback. They like the engagement of how things are working when they couldn't actually use their hands to do it. And when I then expand more to the other quotes, I can see that instructors and administrators acknowledge that these are useful tools, but they're hesitant to engage with these tools. And they're not willing to incorporate them into their curriculum for a number of reasons. It wasn't just perceived usefulness or that they were nervous about learning a new technology. It went into connections to financial reasons, where it was a large investment and some instructors and administrators weren't sure the investment was worth it, because once they were able to get back into the classroom, it might have been a non-useful tool anymore. So that's a factor where we're seeing multiple codes explaining why schools don't use 3D modeling and visuals as much as they potentially could. So in this situation, for this example, technology acceptance might be low and there's hesitation to adopt these changes, which might make the program more resistant to disaster. And there are lots of reasons behind that. But that's one type of analysis, one type of interpretation I could get to with this research. And while we do this, I'm going to start thinking, where can I apply this research? And what's most interesting to the different stakeholders, to the administrators, to the instructors, but also to an educational governing body? What might be most interesting to them? And as I take baby steps back and apply and see the connections from the quotes and the actual data to the theory, that's where I can start to see opportunities to apply the qualitative research to quantitative research. And for this particular project, I might take a step back and say, well, I see connections about student e-learning and tools that help them, but a disconnect to what the instructors are willing to implement. But maybe there's an innovative way and an innovative e-learning resource that can help bridge that gap. And that's where my quantitative data or quantitative research might start helping to bridge that gap and address that disconnect. And this is where we can start to do applications to your work. How can you use qualitative research methods to make your quantitative research stronger? What focused, inductive, and exploratory questions could you ask? And I have some resources here listed. You can email me if you have questions about what these resources are. And so we can, does anyone have any questions? Well, if you don't have any questions and you think of some later, feel free to email me. I want to thank you for participating in this. It's been really wonderful.